Get started. My name is Michael Polson. I'm the director of UC Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center. The CRC was founded in 2017 by a group of social and natural scientists, myself included. Since then, we've focused on our mission of providing cutting-edge research on cannabis, informing policy, and bolstering public dialogue. We've historically focused on issues related to cultivation, community, equity, and ecology. Today's webinar is no exception to all this. With that, I'm excited to be presenting on a project that has been in the making for over 2 years. The project's very loaded but decidedly wonky title is Licensed and Unlicensed Cultivation Across Ban and Permit Jurisdictions. More on that soon. But before we launch into the webinar, I'm going to go over some brief housekeeping. Advance. At the bottom of your screen, you have a few options. First and most important, there's a Q&A button where you can direct all the questions. We won't be checking the chat function, and I'm unclear if it will even be active. I think the panelists may get messages, but if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A. For those that prefer captions, there's also a Show Captions button, and you can always give reactions too. We love applause and hearts, etc. Next slide. As for an agenda, after this intro, we're going to have, thank you, appreciate that. We're going to have a 50 to 55-minute presentation on the findings, takeaways, and recommendations, followed by 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer and a few minutes for closeout. Next slide. To start, I'd like to give an overview of this project and some background on how it came to be. There, this one's animated, so if you could do, yeah, great, thank you. This project was the product of the 6 core researchers present today, as well as several others that I'm going to mention. We came from public health, from political ecology, anthropology, environmental science, energy and resource analysis, and environmental ethics. My name is Michael Polson, as I mentioned. I was the principal investigator on this project. I'm an anthropologist and a researcher at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Second, going down left to right, is Dr. Chris Dillis, who is also a researcher at ESPM, whose work focuses on water usage, cannabis, and data modeling, as you're going to see today. Dr. Margiana Peterson-Rockney is an assistant professor at University of Montana in environmental studies. She's also a visiting scholar at Berkeley and an alumni of ESPM. Dr. Jeremy Sorgan is an assistant research professor at Northwestern University Mills campus and a former Berkeley postdoc in ESPM. Dr. Amanda Ryman is an alumni of UC Berkeley's public health program, is currently at Green Flower, a cannabis education hub, and was formerly of New Frontier Data, a cannabis market intelligence firm. Dr. Ryman served as co-PI for this project. Finally, Seth LaRosa is a graduate student in ESPM and has been with the project from the beginning. I also want to thank Joanna Hossack, JD, at the UC Law School, who did extensive policy analysis and project management, and Kwabena Owusu-Sarfo, who diligently worked on our analysis of indoor cultivation. They both did outstanding work on this project, but couldn't join us today. So this project was funded via Proposition 64 funds and administered by the Department of Cannabis Control. Part of Proposition 64, which legalized cannabis, specified that funding from taxes should be set aside for research. Since 2018, the Department of Cannabis Control and its predecessors have been reviewing and administering the California Academic Research Grant Program. This grant was made possible by this program and by the cannabis taxpayers of California. Just a note for all viewers that this research fund is highly unique in the research world. Most cannabis-related funding comes from the federal government or entities influenced by federal funding restrictions. Having a funding source outside of the federal prohibition research paradigm has been critical for opening up cannabis research and the types of investigations that we can conduct. Californians can be proud of that achievement. Click, please. This effort was actually, you can click twice more, in fact. There we go. Was conducted in and through the Cannabis Research Center and was really fusing of different kind of disciplines, really an effort in interdisciplinary collaboration across the social and natural sciences. The project was a long time in the coming. All of us have met through the UC Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center, which, as I mentioned, is a collaboration between social and natural scientists to address urgent policy-related questions about cannabis agriculture and the ramifications of legalization. But this project gave us a chance to build real collaboration and was likely our most extensive, robust effort yet to bridge disciplinary divides. We employed a fusion of methods, which is usually called a mixed method or interdisciplinary effort. It was not just a layering of methods on top of one another, but rather a concerted effort to explore how varied methodological approaches can inform one another through inter-method feedback loops, refinement of data categories, ground truthing data findings through qualitative inquiry, and using quantitative data to challenge qualitative work. So we really were asking the same question, but getting there through many paths to find an answer. From years of interactions, I think all of us on this panel have come to learn the strengths, but also the shortcomings of our different methodological approaches. No one method can address a question, particularly one as complex and challenging as unlicensed cultivation. Supply chain data tells us one thing, aerial visualizations another, ethnography is still another. Throw in some analysis of policy and energy records, and a picture begins to emerge, a picture larger than that enabled by any one approach alone. By collectively refining our methods over time, we were able to offer as complete a picture as contemporary data sources have to offer. Next slide, please. The question we asked was, why did unlicensed cultivation develop the way it did? Um, uh, okay. Beginning on the right side, we have a few different prior findings that we were beginning. Oops, sorry about that. Um, Sorry about that. Little technical difficulty. Our intention, first of all, oh, actually, apologies. We had a few technical difficulties beforehand, but let me get to the slide here. Great. So our purpose was to discover how was the geography of unlicensed and licensed cannabis cultivation, how has it changed since legalization? In a moment, Seth is going to describe our methodological approaches, but I thought it worthwhile to describe some of the prior findings that motivated this line of questioning. First, local permitting can be a barrier to licensure. Across several studies to date, we've noted how licensure is mediated by local programs, which can be more and less efficient, more and less permissive, and can shape not only how licensure occurs, but whether it can occur. In California, localities can decide whether they will permit or ban cannabis. It goes without saying that anyone cultivating in a banned county is definitionally unlicensed. And many people in counties with steep barriers to entry or inefficient permitting programs were rendered unlicensed when they failed to make it through the permitting process or they decided to never try. Second, marginal growers persist in unlicensed cultivation post-collapse. In 2021, a price collapse in wholesale cannabis pushed many licensed and unlicensed cultivators out of operation, which is reflected in our data today. Two ethnographic projects found that those who persisted in cultivating were often people at the margins of the formal economy, with few other livelihood options. Third, licensed and unlicensed cannabis is being pushed to marginal lands. For different reasons and in different ways, licensed and unlicensed cultivation is generally pushed to land that is not normally dedicated to agriculture. This land is often considered marginal or subprime for cultivation. Fourth, licensing can push cultivation into less sensitive areas. That is, licensing programs can actually help to direct legal cannabis toward less sensitive environments. Finally, bans can worsen environmental and social dynamics. Bans can incentivize the cultivation of cannabis on more environmentally sensitive land. Growers are concerned about enforcement rather than environmental compliance, and they respond to these pressures by moving into more remote areas with an aim to increase crop turnaround. In other words, bans and intensive enforcement can push cultivators to move to environmentally sensitive areas with more impactful practices. With these prior findings in mind, we not only queried how the geography of cannabis cultivation changed, but we wanted to understand what policy and social factors drove those changes, and specifically, if bans or permits were more effective in reducing unlicensed cultivation. More on that soon. I'll pass it off to Seth first, though, to talk about how we went about this study.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to talk quickly just about the methods, and then I'll be back in a bit and I'll talk a bit about some of the results and findings. Um, but on the slide in front of us here, we see some imagery to kind of bullet point through our methods. One of our main methods was Canavision satellite mapping. And this image to the right gives an idea of what that really does. It's a machine learning developed by the Water Board. And basically, it's able to differentiate on the landscape using remote sensing to determine outdoor production and greenhouse structures that are associated with cannabis production. The Water Board's been working on this for some time, and I believe we're the first research team to have access to this tool and to utilize it in a research study. So that was exciting and informative in many respects. This picture to the bottom here, the green graph, is an image of electrical use data, which we were able to access through PG&E through the Public Utility Commission Energy Data Request Program. And what this data gave us was something that law enforcement kind of tipped us to, some DCC law enforcement and others, this idea of a 12-12 photo cycle that you can see in the electrical usage data for indoor production. This helped us make an estimation of indoor production as well as, which complemented our Cannavision data, giving us an idea of what was happening with outdoor production. We also did a license market analysis of metric data, which was a quantitative analysis of licensed production volumes, facility types, and transfer manifests using state track and trace data. And finally, this was tied up with a consumer survey, a comparison of self-reported flower consumption compared to point of sale data to estimate the share of cannabis obtained outside the regulated market, and also what was being consumed and produced within the regulated market. So truly an interdisciplinary study, truly mixed methods. And with these quantitative methods, we attempted to get a comprehensive look at production volume across the state. And importantly, that consumer survey bridged the gap between the regulated sales and actual consumption, allowing us to estimate the scale of the market, again, both the legal market and the unlicensed market across the state. Next slide, please. We're not quite done with methods yet. We also had qualitative methods, which, again, truly interdisciplinary work here. We did a local ordinance analysis. Michael mentioned Joanna Hasek earlier, who led this effort early on in the project. Really comprehensive look at all 58 counties, ban counties, permit counties, thinking about their cannabis ordinances and when they passed and what kind of revisions they went through in time. And also kind of the history, the political and cultural history of those counties. So a lot of data was collected there. And then also, really importantly, the ethnographic case studies that we did in situ in the counties themselves, across 8 counties. I think we had research teams in 6 counties on the ground, and we had data from 2 others. But yeah, like Michael mentioned earlier, it wasn't just an effort to use different methods. It was about layering these kind of different data sets, creating a fusion of methods designed to kind of get an interplay of the data to understand what's happening on the ground, this phenomena of unlicensed and licensed production and where it's taking place. And so by using the Canavision satellite mapping to see what was happening on the ground and then using ethnographic interviews to understand why it was happening from a local perspective, like a boots on the ground understanding, we were able to kind of ground truth the qualitative findings and also inform some of the qualitative questions we were asking. So this sort of many paths strategy allowed us to bridge the disciplinary divide between a strictly geospatial study or a strictly qualitative study. Um, and by integrating these methods, track and trace, the energy consumption, remote sensing, we were able to build a complete picture, or as most complete a picture as possible, of the ever-changing California unlicensed cannabis landscape. And with that, I will hand it over and I'll be back in a bit to talk about results. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Um, yeah, so that was a great segue into the first of the four objectives that I'm going to be going through. As Seth mentioned, as Michael mentioned, we use this mixed method approach. For this first objective, we were heavily relying on Canavision data. We were looking to answer the what happened first before sort of diving into the why it happened. So again, for this, we're just sort of getting a lay of the land before diving deeper. And the findings of this objective, which was to assess unlicensed production amounts and geography, the findings are therefore largely based on the physical variables from our model, such as average hill slope, fire hazard, presence or absence, remoteness, like distance away from incorporated areas, stream network density, that is like length of perennial water courses, per square kilometer, that kind of thing, and so forth. Let me get back on this one. And so, in terms of overall growth and contraction, I think our results are probably not surprising to those familiar with the California cannabis industry. There's a large boom between 2018 and 2020, followed by sort of a sharp decline by 2022. So, albeit unsurprising, it's still validating to see that Canavision was seeing the same thing that we all were. Um, and note that the aerial data we had were available every 2 years, and so they were on even number of years. And so the COVID summer of 2020 has a really strong contribution here, I think, because it's the demarcation line between the two time periods. So the overall change, like I said, 2018 was the boom. Second time period, 2020 to 2022, was sort of a correction. And then by 2024, things, generally speaking, had stabilized, but there was still a lot of regional variation. And then through the whole study period, though, we saw this sort of sustained shift from outdoor to mixed light cultivation, in that, when there was expansion happening, outdoor, or I should say mixed light cultivation expanded more, and when there was contraction happening, outdoor was contracting more. And then, so unlicensed cultivation, in terms of the terrain, apparently became sort of more brazen during the 2018 boom, as a lot of expansion occurred out in the open without the cover of hills. And these areas were also the ones that saw the sharpest declines during the contraction, as sort of enforcement and everything sort of reined those things in a little bit. And then finally, as Michael noted in prior work, but as sort of reiterated with this work, with the ethnographic case studies on the ground, revealing that, by the later time periods in particular, those who were persisting in the unlicensed market were often those without alternatives. And so this has some really interesting implications for enforcement efficacy that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But let me just wrap up this objective real quick with the discussion of what we found for the indoor unlicensed production. And all these methods and stuff, the report is out now, so you can go take a look there for all the details. But just a lay of the land, what we saw, and let me just move my notes a little bit, is that, well, first of all, I'll say that this analysis was especially the what over the why, because it was a pretty heavy lift just to get this part done. So we didn't really get into asking questions about geographical trends and that sort of thing. But we were able to develop a model that let us estimate regional prevalence of indoor cannabis among PG&E users. So the first thing to note here is that in contrast to the sort of roller coaster ride that unlicensed outdoor cultivation had, the indoor cultivation that we were able to study from 2020 to 2023 showed just this slow growth, slow continuous growth. And as you can see from the figure on the right, the counties of the South Central Valley in particular demonstrated a very high prevalence, estimated prevalence of indoor cannabis at a rate, 2 to 3 times higher than in other regions. And so just as I put this up here, I just wanted to make one quick disclaimer that, because of the nature of this sort of estimation task, these figures shouldn't be considered absolute. Our estimates were all based on a presumed global prevalence of 1%. And so it's really just like relative differences that we're trying to show here. But we sort of methodologically tried to account for this as much as possible in our analysis, which you can read about in the report. And this looks like your slide here, Michael.
Great. Yeah, so the second objective we had was to question what factors influence the extent of unlicensed cultivation. Um, we asked why cannabis developed in the ways that we found under Objective 1 by analyzing primarily policy and social questions. And our intention here was to create feedback loops between policy analysis, mapping analysis, and ethnographic case studies. And this had different manifestations, but to give you a sense of what this looked like, the policy analysis and ethnographic analysis provided insights that allowed the shaping of data categories for the mapping data model. And then that resulting model was then run to analyze the counties where we did policy analysis and case studies, helping ethnographers and policy analysts to see the broader patterns of what interviewees might have been trying to convey, and any kind of contradictions that might have emerged from there. Our focus was on ban and permit comparison, but we also chose a number of other cross-cutting factors. As I mentioned, based on our previous work, we were particularly interested in this project regarding the effects that bans and permits might have on unlicensed cultivation. And this matters because one of the primary justifications for bans and permits is that they both would prevent and help to hinder unlicensed cultivation. So we were curious of does one show a pattern more than the other? Next slide. Um, So this objective was to identify factors influencing the observed extent of unlicensed cultivation. We had 7 key findings around this objective. First, the presence of licensed cultivation was most consistently correlated with declines in unlicensed cultivation. In other words, when there was a licensed farm nearby, you'd be less likely to find an unlicensed farm. This result was consistent across all 3 timeframes and was the most evident result from the entire model. In the charts on this page, you can see this analysis across all 3 timeframes, which proceed left to right and top to bottom. The charts are a binary depiction of licensed farm present on the right and absent on the left. The y-axis shows the unlicensed cultivation density. Unlicensed cultivation density is higher on the left side when there's no licensed farm and lower when the licensed farm is present on the right. Second, issues in permitting programs prevented many cultivators from becoming licensed. The second finding made was one that reiterates our prior work. When permitting programs are inefficient, delayed by lawsuits or onerous policy constructions, or too restrictive, more people are rendered illegal. Third, market forces and price decline were major factors in driving unlicensed cultivation decisions. Across the case studies, we heard reports of declines in unlicensed cultivation due to declining wholesale prices. Lower prices shape decisions also about how unlicensed cultivation would continue, if at all. People reduced wages, internalized work to their family systems, and sought cheaper land, often in remote areas. Some chose to reduce their growing to personal gardens, while others abandoned their sites completely. Some tried to grow more, to make up in scale what they lost in prices per pound. This was especially true for people that were, quote, stuck in place, like low-income rural residents, the elderly, and the disabled, whose only ability to make a livelihood had to be connected to their land. As we'll return to, the people still growing unlicensed were often people that had little access to formal markets. Next slide. Bans were not a consistent or powerful indicator of growth or decline in unlicensed cannabis cultivation. The spatial modeling revealed that bans had no reliable effect on unlicensed cultivation. From 2018 to 20, bans didn't have any measurable effect. From 2020 to 22, unlicensed growing in ban counties decreased more quickly than permit counties, so it did have an effect. And then in 2022 to 24, unlicensed growing actually decreased more quickly in permit counties. Notably, in that last period, 7 of the 10 counties with the most growth of unlicensed activity were ban counties, and 2 more counties had stalled and inactive permitting programs. Conversely, the 6 counties with the most decrease in unlicensed cultivation were all legacy cultivation counties with robust permitting programs. The perceived likelihood of strong enforcement, this is second, was an initial deterrent, but became less important over time. Similar to bans, strong eradication enforcement history was not consistent over time, or less consistent over time. At first, cultivators responded to enforcement history by moving away from those counties. As time went on, particularly into the period of the price decline after 2020-21, the effect weakened and then reversed. This suggests that other factors like land prices or cost of business overwhelmed the risk of enforcement. It could also be that areas with less eradication focused enforcement might have had other kinds of regulatory tools that were more effective at stopping unlicensed cultivation. Third, civil policy and civil enforcement efforts became drivers of declines in unlicensed cultivation over time. We found that as time went on, civil policies like fines, landowner liability rules, hemp inspections, and environmental regulations became more effective as they matured and word spread in communities about those policies. Finally, cultivation bans and eradication-based enforcement policies were linked with whack-a-mole dynamics around unlicensed cultivation. Spatial modeling confirmed what we found at the case study level, that bans and strong enforcement kept growers on the move. This is what many call the whack-a-mole effect. Whack-a-molarity, if you will, was also found when landlords were liable for cultivation activity. This is reflected on the graphs to the right, which show that when bans and landowner liability were present, cultivation was less spatially stable. Chris is going to discuss this later, but one thing to consider with mobile sites is the greater potential for environmental impact. Land is being used as quickly as possible, and cultivation moves on, leaving lasting impacts on the land. Now I'll pass it to Amanda for objective 3.
Thank you, Michael. I want to say that whack-a-molarity is my new favorite research term, and hopefully I'm going to get to use that in the future for a study. So, hi everyone. So I looked at the other side of the cultivation coin. We talked a lot about unlicensed cultivation, but the question still remains, what was happening at the same time with licensed cultivation? So this objective was to compare licensed and unlicensed production and estimate leakage of licensed product into the unlicensed market. So we had the objectives of reporting the amount of licensed cannabis being produced during the study period by facility type and county, to track licensed farm product through the supply chain to determine points of leakage and differences in destination based on differences in origin. So, for example, did product from certain regions of the state more likely to go into manufacturing versus go into full flower sales? Did flower from different types of farms, mixed light versus indoor versus outdoor, was that more or less likely to become a certain product after it left the farm? And then we also wanted to compare the amount of cannabis accounted for through dispensary sales with the amount reported by consumers based on a consumer survey. So to do a bit of triangulation, if you will, to see if consumers are accurately reporting how much they're consuming and how that compares to what's being sold. This is done with other products like alcohol, where we have the National Alcohol Survey, where we're asking consumers about their consumption and then comparing that to how much is being reported as sold. Now, when you do research, one of the interesting things is that as you're going through, you get these insights about how easy or hard it is to measure what you want to measure based on the data that are available. And since cannabis is still a fairly new area of research when it comes to the impacts of legalization and legal markets, we're still trying to figure out what is the best way to measure some of these things. Now, most, if not all, legal states have track and trace systems, but are they good research tools or are they better good compliance tools? And that was something we discovered in this study. So, next slide. All right, so first, let's talk about licensed production. So this graph on the right represents the production during the study period of the top 10 counties that have harvested. I know it's very small, but that top spike there, that is Santa Barbara. So you can see that Santa Barbara was by far the highest producing county during the study period. That orange line under it is Monterey. And then underneath that, those little turquoise and green spikes, that's Humboldt and Mendocino. So when we think about where cannabis is being produced, it is most likely to be produced in Santa Barbara. So during the study period, there was 50.4 million kilograms of cannabis produced by licensed farms, according to Metric. The highest was in Santa Barbara County and by mixed light facilities. So just a note, we did see differences in both the type of farm and the geography, which doesn't surprise anyone, right? This is agriculture. So you're going to have cannabis produced in the environment where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck and you're going to be able to scale the most and keep your costs down, which in cannabis tends to be greenhouse production because you are able to utilize the natural sunlight. You're also able to protect the crop from the elements. So you have to ask, all right, well, greenhouses can be expensive to construct. Where can you find already constructed greenhouses in California that can be reused for cannabis and also have policies that are friendly to large scale cultivation? And the answer is Santa Barbara. There's a lot of greenhouses that were used for produce, that were used for flowers, that are no longer in operation. So companies are able to buy up these greenhouses, refurbish them for cannabis. Santa Barbara already has a very friendly climate and very friendly policies. And so that's why we saw a lot of cultivation in Santa Barbara. And there's another reason, which I'll get to in just a minute. So let's get the next slide. So the other thing we wanted to do was compare licensed and unlicensed product and estimate leakage of licensed product into the unlicensed market. So here's where we found out, okay, this data that we were planning to use is not going to quite let us do that. So what we realized with metric data is that once flower leaves the farm, ID numbers are reassigned to batches. So you might have a certain harvest, but that's combined with another harvest, and now it has a new ID number. It goes to the distribution or processing center. It's combined with other batches, especially if it's going into manufacturing. That's assigned another ID number. So there's a real inability to track actual product through the supply chain. Now, maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe that's not something that the state is interested in doing, but from a research perspective, it makes it very hard for us to understand that X harvest coming from Michael's farm went to here and then it went here and then it went here. Because once it leaves that first station, it's getting combined with product from Christopher's farm and Margiana's farm. And then it's going to a manufacturer and then it's becoming distillate. And then that's getting a whole new ID number. And then it's going to a manufacturer to be made into edibles. So the seed to sale tracking is really difficult given the data that we have. So what do? Well, you pivot. So we analyzed manifests of origin and distribution. So instead of being able to track the individual product, we are basically tracking the movement of a shipment of products from point A to point B. So I did not have space to put both the destination and origin manifests on here. So I wanted to just give you a sense of what was happening. So this is kind of the same for both the origin and destination. Southern California rules, right? So most of the product, if regionally, is moving from and coming to Southern California. especially around the 101 corridor. So again, I go back to cannabis, agriculture, consumer packaged good. Where's the most desirable place for it to start from and end up? It's going to be along major roadways. It's another reason why we saw not as much product coming down from places like Humboldt and Mendocino. Next slide. So the triangulation of the consumer data and the POS data. So here we looked at flower from 2022, and this is where we again uncovered some faults in the underlying data. So the point of sale data reported that we had 466.6 tons of cannabis sold. Now, the problem here is that when you sell a pre-roll, you don't mark in the POS data the weight of that pre-roll. So a 0.5 gram pre-roll is marked the same in a POS as a 1 gram pre-roll. So we really aren't able to get down to the actual weight beyond the flower that's sold. Consumers reported consuming 1,400 tons of cannabis, so a lot more than the POS system is reported being sold. And the DCC reported 1,700 tons of cannabis produced. So, what does this tell us? Well, one, it tells us that consumers are obtaining flower outside of the regulated system because they're reporting a lot more consumption than we are seeing sold through stores. And two, that most flower produced is being used for manufactured products because we're seeing a lot more production levels than we are sales through dispensaries. But again, there's a lot of reliability and validity data issues underlying this. So, a final takeaway is that metric, while useful as a reporting tool, was mired with data inconsistency and user error. I could do a whole webinar on the cultivation data in metric and the fact that there were so many errors that we had to exclude entire counties because of missing data or data that was very obviously not valid. And so this really prevented us from having valid and reliable tracking of flower batches once they leave the farm and what was happening on the farm with the data that was being introduced during cultivation. Yeah, so with that, I'll hand it off.
Okay, it looks like it's back to me. So for our fourth and final objective was to assess the potential for environmental impacts of unlicensed production in both ban and permit counties. And so for this assessment, we use a county-based approach, making comparisons between counties. We ranked all of our counties based on three metrics, and then took their average to produce a composite environmental sensitivity rating. So the first metric was stream density network. The first metric was stream network density, which again is just the length of streams per area. The second was the percentage of the county's watersheds that contained critical cell-mounted habitat, using NOAA mapping data for that. And then the final was the proportion of the county's land area that was neither developed or planted. And this uses the National Land Cover Database from the USGS, which sort of maps out all possible land cover types like forest and grassland and city infrastructure, which is developed, and farmed, which is planted. So undeveloped land. So putting all those three together, each county gets a composite score. And what did we find? So in the first time period, we found really no relationship between changes in cultivation density and environmental sensitivity. Cultivation pretty much expanded everywhere, pretty much unabated. And then in the second time period, there was a slight tendency for there to be more reductions occurring in more environmentally sensitive counties. But the sample size was pretty small, and it was too small to reach statistical significance, it looked like. So it was really only during the third time period that we saw this relationship reach statistical significance. These figures are all from this third time period. I have the one on top here is from all counties, and then bottom left is from ban counties, and bottom right is permit counties. And as you can see, the relationship in the permit counties is pretty undeniable in that on the left are the more environmentally sensitive counties, higher ranking counties, that is, in terms of environmental sensitivity. And you see the reduction there. And then to the other extreme, in less sensitive counties, we actually saw increases in unlicensed cultivation. And so when you put these two together, it adds enough of sample size without wiping out, or I should say that the banned counties sort of started to show this pattern a little bit, at least insofar as it didn't wipe out the effect in the permit counties. So when you put them all together, we can say we have this across all counties, we have this relationship of more environmentally sensitive counties are seeing less cultivation by the third time period. And the reason I separate the banned and the permit counties is that we can kind of see that the permit counties are the ones driving this relationship, and it's sort of likely a demonstration of enforcement focus in environmentally sensitive areas or environmentally sensitive counties, as well as perhaps a greater efficacy of enforcement mechanisms in the permit counties in particular. So that's something we're going to get to, I think, in just a minute, if not right now. Let me see what the next slide is. Yeah, we'll
Right.
get there. Is
All
this true?
right,
Okay.
zipping right along. So yeah, we're moving into key takeaways. And so this slide gives our high-level assessment of the efficacy of different strategies to limit unlicensed cultivation and transition legacy growers to the regulated market. So conventional thinking is that unlicensed cannabis should be curbed through a regime of bans, abatements, and enforcement. And here, echoing previous studies, our research shows that this isn't necessarily the case. So first, when we compared banned counties and permit counties, we didn't find that banned counties were any more effective at limiting the growth of unlicensed cannabis. You might think that unlicensed growers would flock to permit counties where they can more easily hide, but this was not the case. Bans, when isolated as a variable, we found that it didn't correlate to either growth or decline of unlicensed cultivation. To understand why, we have to look closer to the ground in terms of capacity for enforcement across entire ban jurisdictions, the density and affordability of land, and other reasons why growers may be drawn to a particular area. These other variables are often stronger indicators than a wholesale county ban. And similarly, we found that eradication-oriented enforcement loses force over time. So in the first time period, 2018 to 2020, a county's enforcement reputation did deter unlicensed growers. We measured enforcement reputation in terms of the total number of plants seized each year, perhaps an imperfect metric, but we had to choose one way of entry. But after the first time period, enforcement reputation had a lower effect on unlicensed cannabis, and actually by the third time period, that is 2022 to 2024, we actually saw enforcement reputation correlated with an increase in unlicensed cultivation. So this is somewhat surprising, and how do we make sense of it? For starters, legal pathways, declining profits, and early enforcement efforts combined to push many unlicensed growers either toward the legal market or out of cannabis markets entirely. This means that those who stayed behind either had a higher risk tolerance or they had fewer alternative options. And again, this is an important point because it means that heavy enforcement tends to reproduce patterns from the war on drugs, targeting racially diverse and socioeconomically disadvantaged people who may have few other viable options. So summarizing these points, we can say that where bans and law enforcement were a county's main strategy to reduce illegal weed, counties found themselves playing a game of whack-a-mole with unlicensed operators who would flee from the scene and then pop up somewhere else. The whack-a-mole metaphor, which you've now heard several times today, it came up so frequently in our interviews that we developed this term whack-a-molarity, and we do hope that will be one of your main takeaways from our presentation. So conversely, what does work? Again, the answer may be somewhat surprising. Among all the variables we looked at, it turns out the presence of a licensed farm had the greatest predictive power for the absence of an unlicensed farm. So the presence of a licensed farm means the absence of unlicensed farms. We chalk this up primarily to civil and code enforcement, as opposed to the expensive and dangerous eradication campaigns that counties find it difficult to bring to scale. The mere presence of a nearby permitted farm deters unlicensed operators because it means greater presence of code enforcement and more foot traffic in general. And Michael earlier pointed out some of the other reasons why this may be the case. So unlicensed farms sometimes hide in plain sight, but in areas more densely populated by people, they can't hide for long. The key takeaway here is that civil enforcement has greater efficacy than blanket bans and traditional law enforcement. And then one final point that I'll just highlight quickly is that we found a positive correlation between permitting programs and environmental outcomes. So permitting reduces cultivation in sensitive areas and cultivates a culture of clean weed, which can even positively affect, this can have a positive effect on unlicensed growers in the area as well. And so these trends are actually the focus of a new project with the Cannabis Research Center that's beginning this year. Next slide.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to keep on with some of the key takeaways now. Chris, thank you for managing the slides. I think I have an animation here. I hope it's not difficult to get through. But first off, some other key takeaways, and some of these Jeremy touched on, so I don't want to be repetitive, but I think it's important to cover these as separate instances, was the kind of boom and bust dynamic that we saw across the years that we looked at the data. After an initial expansion in 2018 to 2020, unlicensed cultivation decreased across the state. Of course, there were differences. It's a big state, different pockets, but we're looking at the overall change. By 2024, total acreage was equal to the 2018 levels, with some variation again across geographies and policy approaches. The initial boom reflected grower optimism and delayed uneven licensing rollouts. Many growers began to expand unlicensed production simply because there was no viable path into the legal market yet. And there was also a perception that law enforcement might be decreased with the passage of the change in the law. The contraction that followed was driven more by a price collapse than by enforcement. By 2022, 2024 imagery that we were looking at, the sector had stabilized at a lower level, with unlicensed operations continuing primarily among those who lacked a clear alternative. Convergence and divergence. Thank you. We saw that unlicensed cultivation persists in more remote areas, away from permitted farms. Those persisting increasingly have few to no other formal livelihood options, are perhaps bound to place for cultural or economic reasons, and are economically and socially marginalized. This divergence is both geographic and socioeconomic. Licensed cultivation moved towards flatter, more accessible ag land, agriculturally zoned areas, closer to roads, while unlicensed operations retreated to historical locations, remote, infrastructure-poor areas. In Nevada and Mendocino County, many older legacy growers who were land rich but cash poor kept cultivating through 2024 without a clear market to sell their product. They couldn't sell their property, the land that they were actually on, had nowhere else to go. And with cannabis as their only income, they just continued production. Communities like Hayfork and areas in Siskiyou County, remote areas of Mendocino, became strongholds, and we saw increases in these areas, but overall, a decrease across the state. One of the other factors that I think was interesting to come out of this study was the idea of community and regulatory norms. The increasing use of civil approaches as opposed to enforcement approach, or as enforcement approaches, but as opposed to law enforcement or criminal enforcement approaches. So permit programs, landlord liabilities, liens, fines, fine regimens. Declining unlicensed cultivation suggests that these policies need time and consistency to work. Education prior to enforcement was also found to be key. In counties like Nevada, cultivators learned to adapt their practices to conform to civil codes over time, adjusting farm locations and designs to avoid environmental enforcement triggers. So in this way, civil code and enforcement was working, but more in a long-term, over time scale. This is in contrast to adaptations to law enforcement, which again brings us back to kind of being perceived as random. Cultivators reported perceiving this as arbitrary and unpredictable. So the key takeaway is that civil enforcement builds norms gradually amongst the community, whereas punitive enforcement just seems to target a certain bad actor, moving them around, contributing to this idea of this whack-a-mole dynamic that again came up so frequently in interviews. Um, and finally, we talked about this a little bit, but again, touching on it more concretely, is the economic driver. Um, with cultivators in particular, particularly unlicensed cultivators, this came up again and again as the number one factor. When prices worsened, the black market and gray market price of a pound of outdoor cannabis, when prices worsened, those with other options typically left the market or did something else. Those without other options stayed. In Mendocino County, one interviewee put it very plainly, the economy has been the best enforcer of the illegal market. Um, Cannabis industry insiders in Lake County also estimated that 30 to 50% of legacy growers dropped out almost entirely because of market conditions, not enforcement or local policy. Um, in the early part of our study in 2020 to 2022, black market cannabis prices collapsed from $1,000 a pound to well below $300 a pound, often below production costs of $250, $400 per pound. So again, those who remained were increasingly on the economic margins for whom cessation would jeopardize basic financial stability. Um, Economics also finally shaped how and where people grew. Interviewees described moving to cheaper land, switching to mixed light operations to do light depths and get more harvests, or shrinking operations to keep growing but to cut costs. No longer having a big team of trimmers or lots of people working on your farm, but minimizing the farm down to a smaller operation cost. So finally, what we can see through this research project is that the market has shifted from a period of rapid expansion to one of stabilization and divergence. These trends, driven by economic necessity, by cultural identity and community norms, and the varying efficacy of local policies, kind of give us a picture of why the unlicensed market is persisting. And by understanding these drivers, the whack-a-mole dynamics, the bans versus permit counties and the normalizing effects of civil regulation, we can then turn to the practical application of this data to provide policy recommendations, which is where we're going to go next. So I will hand it over to Margiana. Thanks. Or is it Chris? Sorry.
It's me. Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah, so our research points to something that's, I think, pretty counterintuitive, that the single most significant factor correlated with declines in unlicensed cultivation is not enforcement. It's actually the presence of licensed farms, which really shapes our first set of recommendations centered around creating, real accessible pathways into the legal market for small scale growers. So first, we recommend maximizing the number of licensed owner-occupied farms dispersed across the state geographically. When farm owners are present in their communities, they carry and really communicate a culture of compliance. And, absentee-owned operations, they just don't do that if the farmer isn't living there on the farm. So more farmers living on their farms means operations need to stay pretty small. And that means revisiting barriers to licensure, expanding where permits are allowed, and trying to reduce the number of large or stacked licenses that have really consolidated ownership in the industry and squeezed out these small scale farmers. Second, statewide pathways that allow small farms to get licensed, even where localities currently ban cultivation, could help do this. Many counties actually, really lack the staff or resources to build permitting programs from scratch. So a statewide carve out for small scale farms could facilitate more small farms, especially or including in currently banned counties where licensed farms could help reduce persistent unlicensed cultivation. So, one idea here would be ministerial permit pathways that could give localities kind of a plug and play option, especially for these jurisdictions that haven't, that are banned because they don't have the capacity to develop their own program. Third, personal cultivation really needs to be genuinely accessible, not just technically legal. Local restrictions that exceed what Proposition 64 intended, particularly bans on outdoor mixed light home gardens, are kind of quietly undermining the law's promise. And we recommend a statewide audit of personal cultivation rules and costs and restrictions to ensure that that right is real in practice and not just on paper. Next slide, please. So our research also raises serious questions about how enforcement resources are being deployed and with what effects, which you've heard quite a bit about today. And we have a few recommendations here. First is that enforcement funding should be tied to accurate and up-to-date data on the actual extent and trajectory of unlicensed cultivation, both to justify funding requests and to demonstrate that prior enforcement actually worked before more resources are moved in that direction. And this matters especially for ban counties that are increasingly seeking state resources for enforcement. And our data shows that ban counties are not only really failing to stop unlicensed cultivation, but they're actually often associated with more significant environmental impacts as those cultivators without a pathway to the legal market are forced further underground, and the sort of light of civil regulation can't shine on them to correct issues. Second, cannabis growers face harsher penalties and more stringent regulations than farmers of other crops. And while agriculture can and should be done in a way to increase environmental benefits and decrease environmental harms, growing cannabis agronomically isn't inherently more environmentally harmful than growing alfalfa or tomatoes. And environmental harms of all crops should be assessed honestly and addressed through outreach, education, and regulatory processes that provide opportunities for behavior correction before harsh and punitive penalties. And as a side note, we have a next project that will be really examining how to do this and doing some comparison between different crops regulatory regimes. And finally, sort of in this bucket, enforcement responses really do need to grapple with why people are cultivating without a license. Eradication-focused law enforcement shows declining efficacy over time. So, what does show promise are multi-agency approaches that incorporate civil, non-punitive measures and address the underlying economic and social drivers of unlicensed cultivations. Heavy fines might deter some cultivators, but when people have no other viable livelihood options, these economic penalties don't eliminate unlicensed farming. They just compound the hardship on already vulnerable communities. So education, pathways to compliance, and services that build resilience in rural communities, they're necessary, and they're not soft alternatives. They're really more effective alternatives. Next slide, please. And our final recommendations make an argument that lasting reductions in unlicensed cultivation will come from better systems, stronger community norms, and genuine economic pathways for those currently outside the legal market. So here, California's track and trace program is hampered right now by human error and inability to follow a harvest from farm to point of sale. A few adjustments could help, streamlining what farmers are required to log and scaling back plant by plant tagging would reduce errors that accumulate under, real on-the-ground farm conditions. And also a non-punitive audit process could encourage accuracy rather than avoidance. Next, for regulation to be truly effective, it needs to shift social norms. And regulations can help shape a culture of compliance, but will never themselves be fully enforceable. So, to shape that culture of compliance and sort of the intra-community norms for more effective, positive environmental and social outcomes, that really needs to be done not through fear of penalties that push growers further underground, but instead, through destigmatizing cannabis and enabling small and resource-limited growers to enter the licensed market. And that can help build social expectations within communities around compliance. So when communities see legal cultivation as normal and locally embedded, there's really less pressure to operate outside of the law, and when that's actually feasible and possible for cultivators. And finally, policy, and this is, a lot of people have talked about this today, but policy really has to reckon honestly with the economic realities driving unlicensed cultivation. Our ethnographic research made this very clear. People aren't growing cannabis without a license out of indifference to the law. They're doing it because land and licensing processes are really expensive, because wholesale prices have collapsed. And for many people in remote and historically marginalized communities, there really aren't very many other viable options. So economic vulnerability is really deeply entangled with poverty and geography. And we need economic development strategies tailored especially to rural, poor, legacy cultivator communities. And we need to bring those communities into the planning process as stakeholders with knowledge and a right to help shape the future of this industry. So with that, I'm going to hand it back, I think, to Michael to wrap up the presentation portion of today.
Well, I think we'll actually we can stop sharing the slides, and what we'll do is oh, did we just lose Margiana somehow? Oh, you are there. Sorry, my bad. Okay, great. All right. Is we'll take some questions. I know there's a few maybe just quick answers here. Uh, One is from Anthony Torres. Is the Canavision tool data and data publicly accessible? I guess that's a question for Chris.
You're
You're
muted, Chris.
Whoops. It's not something that's like, publicly hosted, but if you get in contact with them, I mean, there's a fair amount of restrictions about what they can share. But there's process to do that. So if you're interested, you can reach out to us and I can put you in contact, or you can reach out to them directly.
And then second is for unlicensed and cultivation and consumption data, which I guess is both for Chris and Amanda. Does the Prop 64.6 plant allowance influence data sets or any trends?
Well, I can talk about consumption. So we did another study of consumers and found that about 2% grow their own cannabis. So home cultivation is pretty rare. I would say that where people are getting cannabis from, if it's not from the store, is more likely an unlicensed cultivator that's growing at a commercial scale, or someone that has both licensed and unlicensed cultivation streams happening off of their property. There are still a whole host of unlicensed dispensaries around the state, especially in places like Southern California. So it's unlikely that that difference is being made up for by people just growing their six plants, and more likely they're accessing commercial scale cultivation or retail through the unlicensed channels.
And Chris, I know for Canavision, you had some exclusions, right, um, for six plants and under for small.
Yeah, they sort of restrict their training data to gardens of a specific size. So, and that specific size is like 6 plants.
Great. Yeah. Um, the next question was from Rihanna Durrett. Hi. Um, did you collect on any information on cannabis being exported out of state? And so, yeah, we weren't particularly inquiring as to where cannabis was going. It was more just the dynamics of how people make decisions about whether to farm, how much to farm, how to farm, etc. Um, but one thing I will point out is that there was a report a year ago issued by ERA Economics that was commissioned by the state of California. And that does have some information about likely diversion from California into other states. And it's quite a large number. I mean, Jared's here, he could probably say, but the number, yeah, you're welcome. That report is publicly available. I believe it's up on the DCC's website. What I will point out is that that what Chris showed in that first slide on objective one is that unlicensed cannabis cultivation that's like dedicated unlicensed farms that's like completely out of the licensing system has more or less reduced, I mean, in uneven ways across the state, but as an aggregate to 2018 levels, meaning that the boom in unlicensed cultivation is quite done. And where what I think that suggests is because we know that out-of-state shipments haven't stopped, is that really it's leakage from the legal supply chain, which is a significant motor of out-of-state outlets or motion, really. That was especially true because of the hemp loophole that opened the same year that California put out its rules around legal cannabis and set up its regulatory system, as well as the problems that Amanda was referring to in relationship to metric and being able to track data. So I think. Yeah, we can maybe put to rest a little bit the worry that there's some mass amount of unlicensed cultivators out there that are sending stuff out across the nation, and more begin to theorize a bit about the license system itself. Seth, were you going to jump in there?
Actually, I was just going to say one thing to Rihanna's point that yes, through some of the ethnographic data that we collected, talking to unlicensed producers, there was mention of people still shipping out of state. I think Michael's right that that's not really the regulatory focus for thinking about how to bring everyone into compliance per se. But yeah, there was a mention of the price point again as it collapsed in California, people going to other markets, and as those price points also lowered, there being sort of a dearth of places to sell people's cannabis at. So it was talked about from producers for sure.
Yeah, that actually dovetails with the question that we got in the chat, which I'll just insert here, which is from Alex Diamond about were you able to come to any insights in how the receiving markets for unlicensed California grown cannabis changed over the course of the study? And I know from previous field work and during this period, of course, Oklahoma and Oregon, with their medical and hemp programs respectively, were quite influential, I think right around 2021, 22, maybe into 23, right at the time of the price drop. But also just the ongoing kind of succession of states that have legalized has really changed the landscape for where cannabis can travel out of state. And oftentimes now it seems out of the country. So that is, of course, policy questions have a lot to do with that. And also the rapidness of how licensing systems are set up. We know that New York really has taken a while to come on board for some good reasons, but also that the lack of cultivation and supply has been a whole, has provided an opportunity for out of state, including California cultivators, to send product. So there was a second question about what was behind the 2021 price drop, and that is a big question. The ERA Economics report has dealt with that a fair amount. We've dealt with it on a report on our website, crc.berkeley.edu, around unlicensed cultivation. You can access that. But generally, I would just point to three major factors, one of which is overproduction, that too much cannabis was being grown in California related to California's consumption. Second, and derivative of that point is over licensing, is that too much space was actually allowed to be grown, and this actually caused and facilitated that overproduction. And then third is underconsumption, that there aren't enough retail outlets in the state of California to adequately meet consumer demand. So those three things together, I think, are primary drivers, but there's many other kind of factors, including COVID and some of its dynamics and the inflation that came afterwards. So any other things to add to that from anybody? A few more questions here. Okay, Amanda, this one's for you from Jarrett. Was a consumer survey on cannabis consumption issued by UCB, or what was the reference survey?
So that was a survey that was actually conducted by New Frontier Data in 2023. It was a nationally representative consumer survey of never, potential, and current consumers based on the census data of state population, age, ethnicity, and gender. So a great deal of those respondents, or almost 5,000 respondents, came from California because of the size of the state. So we just isolated the California consumers and analyzed their consumption data.
Great. And I see that Seth is responding to Caleb. Um, and this is a question, maybe Margiana, you'd care to take this or any others. The importance of ensuring a voice for legacy cultivation communities within policymaking processes was mentioned. I was wondering if there are any established advocacy groups or other public voices for unlicensed cultivators.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think the short answer is no. And there are certainly groups that are advocating for the needs of legacy cultivation communities. But really, I think focusing on legacy communities that are entering the permitted or have entered the licensed market, I think it's very hard for people who are unlicensed and therefore vulnerable to enforcement to come together and, have a public voice. Um, I think there are some ways that that is happening, some examples, but it's kind of like around the edges of cannabis, maybe talking about issues of, for example, water access, or issues of permitting for building greenhouses or even homes with septic tanks or wells, but not directly around cannabis because those communities can't speak out publicly.
And one thing I'll add to that is that this project was really designed in many ways to be able to assess kind of what's going on in unlicensed communities, specifically because those communities generally aren't able to have a public voice, which is ironic in a sense because there actually was a public voice prior to legalization for unlicensed cultivators before this legal apparatus came about. So in essence, then this really makes it quite critical that research like this is done so that we can really assess and understand through granular case studies about what people are experiencing on the ground, because that data does not make it into official data sets. It's not tracked by metric. It doesn't show, it might show up on maps. And so we tried in every way possible to get at what the conditions are and decision-making processes for folks who are still unlicensed. Um, okay, one more. From Ya, my community was the Round Valley area of Mendocino, and a lot of time and effort was put in by cultivators to give recommendations to the county for policy development. They simply didn't listen. I think this needs to be noted as well. Absolutely. And what we've seen, I know Amanda and Seth can speak to this in Mendocino in particular, but right, is this kind of like slow process of permitting rollout, if not completely upended process of actually setting up regulatory programs. And I encourage and invite everyone to read through the report in each of the counties that we've done case studies, which I guess we didn't actually mention them. It's Lake County, Mendocino County, Trinity County, Siskiyou County, Riverside County, and Nevada County. And so we all spent time in these different counties to really understand how policy developed, what some of the dynamics were on the ground, and what that means for unlicensed and licensed cultivation today. So that is in the appendix of the report. You'll find longer 10 to 15 page reports on this. You'll also find in the body of the main report kind of brief um, kind of schematics of what we found in those particular counties.
I just had one thing to add there that, yeah, I hope you can take some time to look at that appendix. I actually was in Mendocino County doing the ethnographic work there. Amanda lived there for years and has quite a bit of knowledge around the area. But yeah, spent some time in Round Valley myself, a couple of days, talked to people at the M&M feed store, some cultivators. It was definitely an interesting case study. So yeah, please, I hope you take the time to take a look at the appendix
And I
specific
just
to
want to
Mendocino.
add one thing. Yeah, I lived in Mendocino for 7 years in Ukiah, and places that have a lot of legacy cultivation, the people there not only have very strong feelings about cannabis, but a lot of times they confuse the impacts of what they saw with unlicensed cultivation during Prohibition with what licensed cultivation looks like during legalization. So you have people that assume that licensed cultivation is going to bring a lot of the same issues that operating something under prohibition brought to communities, or some of the same benefits that operating something under prohibition brought to the same communities. So just my little piece of advice, having sat through countless Board of Supervisors meetings, is that it's important to educate people about the differences. And I think you can use this report as evidence of the presence of licensed cultivation being the biggest deterrent for unlicensed cultivation, and helping people understand that we're talking about two different systems. And sometimes it's building a new system, but in legacy counties, it's a lot about transitioning people from an old system to a new system, which takes a whole different set of rules and expectations that it sometimes can be hard for people that have kind of grown up around the legacy community to understand what that looks like. And so it does take a little extra than it does in some county that's deciding for the first time whether or not they want to have cannabis be a presence in their community.
Chris, if you could put up the slides one last time. Thank you, Amanda, for those last words. And yeah, I mean, in addition to Mendocino, I'll do a little shout out. Maybe I'm biased, but but the, Nevada County case study, I think, is pretty illustrative in terms of what happens when policymakers listen and then act to actively craft and respond to a small and legacy oriented cultivation system. So I want to say thank you so much to the panelists and to the audience. As a reminder, you can visit, please go back. All right. As a reminder, you can visit crc.berkeley.edu to see any past recordings on other projects and topics, like the one we held last month on tribal consultations for cannabis projects, which featured Jeremy and Seth from today. Next month, if you're in the area, which is the Humboldt area rather, you can check out the third annual symposium on cannabis and environmental stewardship. I'm unclear if that is also going to be broadcast, but there might be a virtual option. You can check out the site. But Seth and our very own Pang Lor will be speaking there, and you can contact Dan Marr at djb13 at humboldt.edu. The address is down there. Now you can go to the next slide. Um, so I want to say thank you to the Department of Cannabis Control for funding and administering this grant, to the many, many, many undergraduate students that worked on this. I think at last count, we had over 30 undergraduate students that were trained in research methods. I want to say thank you to Peng Lor, our administrative and communication specialist at the Cannabis Research Center, and also to Joanna Hossack, Kwabena Owusu-Sarfo, and Van Butzik for all their work on this project as well. A special shout out to my research administrator, Stephanie Ragazzo, and to the wonderful staff at the Office of Policy and Research at the Department of Cannabis Control. Thank you finally to the Resources Legacy Fund and the Campbell Foundation for your ongoing support of the Cannabis Research Center. And so here on this slide, at the CRC, we have ongoing webinars like this one. So if you haven't already, sign up for our listserv or follow us on social media. You can go to our link tree through the bit.ly link or the QR code on the left, or you can sign up directly for our newsletter by scanning the QR code on the right. Also, on here, there is a link to the data and findings, which you can explore yourself at our new project site, crc.berkeley.edu/canageogs. So with that, I'm going to leave this screen up. Chris, don't click out too soon. And you all can get the QR code. But thank you so much for everyone for coming. And feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us through the website or our emails at Berkeley. And thank you so much to this team. It's been a really wonderful 2 years plus of working together. And we're done. So thank you so much to everyone. Appreciate it.